Story 2. My grandma once took me to a funeral for a man neither of us knew. She said, "It's important to show respect." But I noticed she spent the whole service studying the widow like she was trying to solve a murder mystery. When I asked her about it later, she said, "Oh, I just like seeing how people grieve. You can tell a lot about someone by their tears." The next week, she brought a casserole to another random funeral. I'm 90% sure she wasn't mourning anyone. She just really enjoyed the free sandwiches. Story 3. My neighbor Larry turns everything into a competition. Last summer I mentioned I was trying to get back into running, and the next thing I know he's bought a full marathon kit. New shoes, hydration pack, and one of those running hats with a brim. He ran laps around the block for a week and then quit because the pavement was messing up his knees. Meanwhile, I'm still jogging in my old sneakers and getting winded halfway up my street. But hey, I guess I won by default. Story 4. I babysat my neighbor's cat once, and I swear it was the meanest animal I've ever met. Every time I walked in, it gave me this look like, "Oh, you again." The cat knocked over a plant, then sat next to the mess, staring at me like, "Clean it up, peasant." When the owner came back, she laughed and said, "He's just showing he missed me." Lady, your cat didn't miss you. He was plotting my demise for feeding him the wrong flavor of tuna. Story 5. One time I called out a friend for tossing a candy wrapper out the car window. He gave me this long-winded excuse about how birds use trash for nests, so technically he was helping nature. A week later, we're on a hike and he trips on a rock, face-planting right into a pile of his beloved helpful trash. Poetic justice smells a lot like old McDonald's wrappers baking in the sun. Let me know if you want more short and funny ones. Story 6. When my husband and I were newlyweds, I thought I'd finally found some sense of belonging. Being adopted, I'd always had this underlying anxiety about not fitting in, but he assured me his family would welcome me with open arms. His mom, though, had other plans. She found out I was adopted, which wasn't exactly a secret. I've known some of my biological family for years, but she treated it like she'd uncovered a dark scandal. Suddenly, every conversation was dripping with condescension. "Oh, well, you wouldn't understand," she'd say, emphasizing how I didn't grow up in a real family. The final straw came when she brought it up at a family barbecue, loudly speculating about whether my birth parents were troubled and insinuating I'd passed on some kind of bad genes to my kids. I felt my face burn as everyone stared, and I realized she was never going to stop. My husband eventually cut contact with her after a particularly cruel comment about our parenting, but it took years for me to shake the damage her words caused. Story 7. I'll never forget my first real experience with gaslighting. It came from my boss at my first real office job. She was one of those people who seemed so bubbly and positive on the surface, but the moment you disagreed or questioned her, the claws came out. Once I mentioned in a meeting that a system she implemented wasn't working well for the team, thinking I was just offering constructive feedback. She smiled and said she'd look into it, but afterward she pulled me into her office and accused me of sabotaging her authority. I was floored. I apologized even though I hadn't done anything wrong, and promised to be more careful. After that, it became a pattern. If I ever suggested something different or questioned a directive, I was being difficult. By the time I quit a year later, she had the whole office believing I was this angry, impossible-to-work-with person, all while she maintained her cheery facade. It was a textbook case of narcissistic manipulation, and it still makes my skin crawl when I think about how easily she fooled everyone. Story 8. I didn't notice how much tension surrounded my best friend's marriage until I spent a long weekend at their house. They had always seemed happy on the surface. Cute selfies, little jokes about their quirks, the kind of couple you'd envy. But as soon as I walked through their door, the cracks began to show. Her husband, Dan, barely greeted me before grumbling about some mess in the kitchen. She laughed it off, saying, "Oh, you know how he is," and quickly started cleaning up, even though it was spotless. Throughout the weekend, I noticed little things. The way her shoulders tensed whenever he walked into the room, how she always asked his permission before making even the smallest decisions, and how their kids went quiet the moment he spoke. One night, after the kids were asleep, we opened a bottle of wine. I hesitated, but I finally asked, "Are you okay? Like, really okay?" She gave me this tired smile and said, "It's just how he is. He gets stressed easily, and I try not to make it worse." Then she changed the subject. The next day, Dan was in a bad mood. He snapped at her over something ridiculous. She hadn't folded his laundry the way he liked. And I saw her flinch. I tried to lighten the mood, joking that my folding skills were even worse, but he just glared at me like I'd overstepped. The rest of the weekend was awkward. On the drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. She had always seemed so strong and independent, but around him she was like a shadow of herself. It made me realize how easy it is for someone to lose themselves in a relationship like that, how the small, subtle digs can wear a person down until they believe they're the problem. I still see her sometimes, but she's distant now, as if she's afraid I might bring it up again. I wish I could help, but I've learned that unless someone wants to leave, there's not much you can do. Story 9. I had a best friend in high school who I trusted more than anyone. We did everything together, movies, late-night talks, inside jokes. But looking back, there were so many little red flags I ignored. One time we were laughing about this silly nickname we gave a teacher, and later, in front of a group of classmates, she acted like I was the only one who came up with it, loudly saying, "Wow, that's kind of mean, don't you think?" She did stuff like that all the time, turning on me to get a laugh or score points with other people. The worst, though, was when she told my biggest secret. I had a massive crush on this guy in our grade, and I swore her to secrecy. A week later, it was all over school, complete with exaggerated details I'd never shared. When I confronted her, she said, "Oh, come on, it's not like it was a big deal." I cut her off after graduation, but to this day, I'm cautious about who I trust because of her. Story 10. It wasn't until I spent a holiday without my ex-husband that I realized how bad things had been. My sister invited me to spend Christmas with her and her kids, and for the first time in years I felt light, happy. The house was full of laughter, wrapping paper everywhere, and the kids squealing with excitement. Then my ex showed up. Within minutes, the air shifted. He barely greeted me, refused to hug me, and started complaining about the noise. I found myself walking on eggshells, apologizing for things that weren't even my fault, just trying to keep him from having one of his infamous meltdowns. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking, this was my life for 10 years. Constantly focused on avoiding his anger, never on the actual joy of living. 8 months after separating, I still wake up every day grateful I finally got out. Story 11. I used to have this coworker who was impossible to deal with because everything was a competition. If I mentioned I'd taken a weekend trip, he'd talk about how he backpacked through Europe for 6 months. If I said I was taking a night class, he'd brag about his natural intelligence and how he didn't need extra learning. But it wasn't just annoying, it was insidious. Once, during a big meeting, I shared a successful project I'd completed, and he immediately chimed in with, "Oh yeah, I did something similar but way bigger last year." It wasn't even true. He'd lie through his teeth just to make himself look better. The kicker came when he told our boss that I'd stolen one of his ideas, an idea I'd been working on for weeks before he even knew about it. I proved him wrong, but the damage was done. People like him don't just one-up you. They'll trample over anyone to stay on top. Story 12. There was a guy I used to work with named Brian, and he was the textbook definition of walking on eggshells. On the surface, he was one of those charismatic types who always had a big laugh and a story to tell, but beneath it was this fragile ego that made him impossible to be around. The first time I saw it, we were in a team meeting. I made a small suggestion about improving a process we'd been working on, and he immediately shot it down. "Well, we've already tried that," he said, his voice tight. I could feel the tension in the room, but I didn't think much of it. Later, though, he pulled me aside and said, "Just so you know, it's not a good look to undermine someone in front of the team." I was stunned. Undermine him? I'd just been trying to help. Over time, I realized this was his pattern. If anyone so much as hinted at disagreeing with him, he'd take it as a personal attack. He'd sulk, make passive-aggressive comments, or go out of his way to one-up the person who'd crossed him. Once, a co-worker got praised for a big project, and Brian spent the entire next week dropping hints about how he'd inspired their idea. The worst, though, was how he treated people he didn't consider useful. I saw him tear into a new intern for making a mistake on her second day, calling her incompetent, loud enough for the whole office to hear. What finally broke me was when he turned on me. I'd gotten a promotion, and instead of congratulating me, he started nitpicking everything I did. He'd CC our boss on emails pointing out minor mistakes, casually mention things I'd forgotten in meetings, and generally make my life miserable. It got to the point where I dreaded going to work. I ended up leaving that job not long after, and I've been careful ever since about spotting those red flags early. People like Brian might seem harmless at first, but their insecurities can poison an entire environment. Story 13. I didn't even know what gaslighting was until I started dating Mark. He was charming at first, always quick with a joke and great with my friends. But whenever we argued, his true nature showed. He had this uncanny ability to twist everything around. If I confronted him about standing me up, he'd deny it outright. That didn't happen. If I showed him my messages proving it did, he'd downplay it. Okay, maybe I was late, but it wasn't a big deal. If I pressed further, he'd blame me. You always make such a huge deal out of nothing. You're so sensitive. I started questioning my own memories, my own reactions. The worst part was how convincing he was. My friends even started siding with him. It wasn't until I stumbled across the phrase "narcissist's prayer" online that it clicked. That relationship taught me to spot those patterns from a mile away now, but it also left scars I'm still healing from. Story 14. I used to be part of a tight-knit group at work. We had happy hours, inside jokes, the whole thing. Then a new coworker, Sarah, joined. At first, she seemed nice enough, but something felt off. She was always pulling people aside for quiet little chats, usually with a smug expression on her face. I didn't think much of it until one day, another coworker mentioned, "Sarah said you were upset about not being invited to her birthday party." I was baffled. I hadn't even known she'd had a party, let alone cared about not going. Slowly, I realized she was planting these seeds of drama, trying to turn us against each other. By the time I caught on, the group dynamic was ruined. People started avoiding me, and even though I tried to confront her, she played innocent, acting hurt that I would accuse her of such a thing. I ended up leaving that job, but I'll never forget how one person's whisper campaign destroyed something I'd loved. Story 15. There was a man in my friend group named Chris who, on the surface, seemed like the sweetest guy in the world. He was always smiling, volunteering to help, and ready with a joke to lift the mood. If you needed a ride to the airport, he was there. Moving furniture? Chris would show up early with a truck. Everyone loved him, and honestly, so did I, at first. But over the years, I started to notice little things about him that didn't quite add up. For one, Chris had a habit of subtly putting people down under the guise of humor. If someone shared an accomplishment, he'd make a joke that didn't quite land. When our friend Sarah mentioned getting a promotion, Chris quipped, "Wow, guess they were desperate." Everyone laughed awkwardly, but Sarah's smile faltered. Later, when I asked her about it, she brushed it off, saying, "Oh, that's just Chris. He doesn't mean anything by it." That was his shield, his harmless persona. The real crack started to show during our group camping trip last summer. Chris had offered to organize everything, reserving the site, planning meals, even coordinating carpooling. We all praised him for being so on top of things, but as the weekend unfolded, his true nature came out. He started snapping at people over small things, like when someone forgot to bring firewood. "You had one job," he said to Paul, his tone half joking but his face stone cold. He dominated every conversation, turning lighthearted group banter into debates he always had to win. At one point, he even joked about Sarah's boyfriend being out of her league, which left her looking embarrassed and quiet for the rest of the night. The final straw came on the last day. We were packing up when I overheard Chris talking to another friend about me. "You know," he said, "she's always acting like she's better than everyone, with her big city job and her fancy clothes." My heart sank. I hadn't done anything to deserve that. I'd been kind to him, always supportive. But as I stood there, listening to him tear me down behind my back, everything clicked. The jokes, the subtle digs, the fake helpfulness. It was all about control. Chris needed to feel superior, and he did it by chipping away at everyone around him, one small comment at a time. When we got home, I started pulling back from the group. I didn't want to create drama, but I also couldn't stomach being around him anymore. Sarah and I grew closer after I confided in her, and she admitted she'd been feeling the same way for years. Eventually, others started noticing too, and Chris's mask began to slip. People stopped laughing at his jokes, stopped inviting him to things. He didn't take it well. There were a lot of passive-aggressive social media posts about fake friends, but none of us felt bad. Looking back, I realize how dangerous people like Chris can be. They seem harmless at first, maybe even helpful, but their true nature is revealed in the little things, the jokes that cut too deep, the help that comes with strings attached, the way they always manage to make you feel small. I've learned to trust my gut when something feels off, even if everyone else seems to like the person, because sometimes the nice guy is just a cover for something much uglier. Story 16. Have you ever met someone who's just a little too nice? That was my old college roommate, Jenna. She was all smiles, constantly volunteering, and always the first to post inspirational quotes on Instagram. But behind closed doors, she was a completely different person. I remember once, she snapped at me because I didn't vacuum the apartment, saying, "Do you know how much I do for this place?" Even though we split chores evenly. The kicker, though, came when we got into a fight over something petty, and she started airing my personal business to our friends. She played the victim, painting me as this unreasonable monster while she was just trying her best. People took her side because she was so sweet and saintly on the surface. It wasn't until she pulled the same stunt on one of our mutual friends that everyone saw through her act. By then, the damage was done, and I'd learned my lesson about people who are too good to be true. Story 17. Growing up, I thought my dad was just strict. He always had a short fuse, but he'd call it discipline, so I figured it was normal. It wasn't until I got older that I started noticing how different life felt when he wasn't around. My mom, sister, and I would laugh more, joke more, and just feel lighter in general. I vividly remember one summer evening when he went out of town. We had an impromptu barbecue, danced in the kitchen, and stayed up late watching movies. When he came back, though, the mood shifted immediately. My sister and I stopped talking mid-sentence. Mom went quiet, and the house felt like it was holding its breath. I realized then that it wasn't just me. He was the storm cloud that followed us everywhere. Years later, when I moved out, I promised myself I'd never let someone like that control my happiness again. Story 18. When I started dating Jason, I thought he was just confident. He talked about his accomplishments a lot, sure, but I figured he was just proud of his work. It wasn't until we'd been together for a year that I realized he didn't just love himself, he was obsessed. Anytime I tried to talk about my day or something that was bothering me, he'd steer the conversation back to him. I remember one time I was venting about a tough situation at work, and he interrupted with, "That reminds me of when I got promoted. Let me tell you how I handled it." It wasn't just annoying. It was lonely. The worst part was, he could never admit fault. If I called him out, he'd either brush it off or turn it around on me, saying I was too negative. It took me 3 years to see the truth. He didn't have room in his world for anyone but himself. Story 19. My grandmother was one of the most complicated people I've ever known. On the surface, she seemed like the perfect matriarch. Baking cookies, sending birthday cards, hosting big holiday dinners. But there was a darker side to her that I didn't fully understand until I was an adult. For one thing, she had this bizarre obsession with funerals. I'm not talking about attending services for friends or family. She would go to strangers' funerals just to watch people grieve. I remember one time when I was about 10, she dragged me along to the funeral of someone neither of us knew. When I asked why we were there, she said, "It's important to pay your respects." But I noticed the way she'd lean in, watching every tear, every sob, with this strange intensity. As I got older, I started seeing the pattern. She loved misery. Not her own, of course, but other people's. She'd ask leading questions to get people to share their hardships, then sit back and soak it all in like she was watching a soap opera. Once, during a Thanksgiving dinner, my uncle mentioned he'd been having marital problems, and she jumped on it. "Oh, you poor thing," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "What happened?" He tried to brush it off, but she kept pushing until he finally snapped, saying, "You just love this, don't you? You love seeing people fall apart." The room went silent, but she just smiled and said, "I'm only trying to help." When she passed away, I expected to feel sad, but mostly I felt relief. I know how awful that sounds, but her presence was like a black hole, sucking in everyone's pain and leaving nothing but tension in its wake. I still think about her sometimes, wondering what made her that way. Was it trauma? A need for control? Whatever it was, it taught me to be wary of people who seem too interested in other people's suffering. It's rarely about compassion. It's about power. What are very subtle signs that someone is a horrible person? Story 1. There's a guy in my neighborhood who I'm convinced believes he's Batman, but for grocery carts. I first noticed him when I was at the store, struggling to load my trunk while keeping my toddler from escaping his car seat. I abandoned my cart in the empty parking space next to me for maybe 10 seconds, and out of nowhere, this dude swoops in like a cart vigilante. "We've got cart returns for a reason," he says, pushing it away dramatically like he just saved Gotham. The kicker? His own car was halfway parked over the line into another space. Real hero material.